This is a lecture on Ignacio Ellacuria's 1975 essay, Is a Different Kind of University Possible? The context of this essay is 10 years after the founding of the UCA, the University of Central America, Jose Simeon Cañas in San Salvador, in El Salvador, and taking stock of those 10 years from its founding on September the 15th, 1965. So it's a retrospective. Uh, Korea is going to take a look at what their intentions were, take a look at where they succeeded in trying to fulfill those intentions, where they failed, where they came up short. At the time, UCA was just the second of two universities in El Salvador. There's a much longer running institution, and then this new institution that Ellacuria and his fellow Jesuits helped to found. So that's what this discussion is about. And he raises some important questions, not just for his own university, but also for ours as well. Now, he wants to talk about 5 different characteristics of the university: the horizon of the university, the what he calls the field or sphere of the university, the way or method of the university, the disposition of the university, and the objective of the university. And he'll explain each of those 5 characteristics as he goes, and I'll see how they apply to his university. And what I'd like us to do is try to think about how we would fill in the blanks for these 5 characteristics. How do they show themselves in our university? So first, the horizon of the university. For Ellacuria, that's the oppressed majority. That's his Christian preferential option for the poor manifesting itself in the university setting. Now, that word horizon, remember from our discussions of hermeneutics and interpretation, the horizon is that against which our lives, our choices, our actions make sense. My metaphor of if we were in a classroom, of the overhead projector, shining my slides up on a screen. If you took away the screen, you took away the wall behind the screen, and you just shine the light of the overhead projector out into the atmosphere, you wouldn't be able to see anything. It's only against that screen, only against the horizon, that things will show up, and they'll show up in such a way that it, in some ways, reflects or is configured by that horizon. So if we had a deformed screen, what we show on the screen would be equally deformed or deformed in a complementary or parallel way. So we want to know what the horizon is, and we want to try to be sensitive to how that horizon allows what a university is supposed to be, how it lets that show up, appear. For Ellacuria, he's talking about the 99% as opposed to the 1%. And you'll recall from an earlier lecture, he says, even though we're as university people, we're meant to be objective, that does not mean we have to be impartial, that it is necessary to take sides. And for him, it's to take the side of the 99%. He writes, quote, cannot take as a fundamental criterion and ultimate horizon for its activities the subjective interests of students and professors, unless these subjective interests coincide with the objective interests of the oppressed majority. So when we're looking at whose interests should be taken into account, he says not necessarily those of students and professors, even though we're the ones who are here, aren't we? The students and the faculty and the staff, the administrators, not necessarily them. He says, unless our subjective interests coincide what he calls the objective interest. Now, it, you may remember from your studies of Immanuel Kant the idea of the goodwill. He says there's 2 kinds of maxims for acting, 2 kinds of statements of why you did what you did: a subjective maxim and an objective maxim. So if I ask you, why are you in class today? Whatever you answer, that's your subjective maxim. That's your own personal idiosyncratic reason for being in class. Maybe you were there to learn. Maybe you were there because you have a good friend in the class. Maybe you had nothing better to do. Maybe you just like the exercise that you get from going from one place to another on campus. Doesn't really matter. That's your subjective reason for being there. But Kant also said that there are objective reasons for reasons anyone should have for doing certain things, even if no one actually subjectively has those for reasons. So when it comes to being in the classroom, Kant would say, the objective reason for being there is to learn. That's the objective reason. You may have other subjective reasons. That might not be your reason for why you're there, but it should be your reason for why you're there. There are objective reasons. Well, Ellacuria is saying the same thing. People go to the university and they want to get all kinds of things out of it. But what ought we to want to get out of it? What ought to be the goal? He says that comes from identifying our interests with those of the unjustly dehumanized majority, the crucified ones of history, as he calls them. That's the horizon under which the university has to understand itself. Now, what about the field or sphere of the university? In other words, where does it operate? And the answer is in culture. And he hears that word culture like you would hear in agriculture. It's about the cultivation of reality. You know, when you farm, you gotta work the land. You gotta cultivate that crop. You gotta work on it, try to bring it forth, get it to grow. That's what he has in mind here when he talks about culture being the sphere. It has that praxic meaning that we talked about, a need for an activity that transforms, a need for an activity that cultivates. He says it requires rigorous knowledge of nature and society, an episteme, and techniques for transforming nature and human beings and society, what Aristotle would call then techne and phronesis, know-how and practical wisdom. He says that it must be derived from the national reality as it unfolds concretely in history. Again, he's not talking about abstractions and he's not talking about ideals. He's talking about getting to know and then figuring how to transform the historic concrete reality of his nation that he's concerned with. And it's a nation of a majority who are poor and oppressed. Uh, Culture for him, he writes, culture as knowledge, while it has often served as a tool of domination at the service of whoever pays best, has also been and is inherently a critique of what is, as well as a jolt to arouse people from tranquil slumber. Creative culture entails breaking, although the first barrier it often encounters is the previous culture that has been fossilized or set into stone, is no longer cultivating us in the way that's best. And I think he has in mind here, in the language, if you're familiar with it, he has in his mind here Socrates. Socrates was the gadfly who tried to awaken Athens from its slumbers, try to wake it up, try to get it to reflect on itself and understand who it is and why it is and how it is best for it to be. And Plato always contrasted Socrates with a group of political persons called the sophists. Uh, the sophists were in many ways the first teachers. Socrates always said, "I'm not a sophist. I never asked for pay." Sophists could be identified because you paid them to teach you. Teach you what? How to be persuasive, to teach you rhetoric, how to persuade somebody to see your point of view. The sophists tended to think there was no real truth, so all there was opinion. And if all there is opinion, then opinions really matter. And all things considered, it's better if people share your opinion than reject your opinion. So they thought that the best thing that we could learn to do is to give a persuasive speech, to talk people into seeing things from our point of view. It didn't really matter what our point of view is if there is no set truth. It just was a matter of winning. So in some ways, sophists were like our lawyers in our adversarial legal system. You don't want a lawyer, if you get in trouble, you don't want a lawyer who's looking for the truth. You want a lawyer who's going to get you off. You want a lawyer who's going to make your case as well as it can be made. But Socrates was not interested in who benefits from one position or another. What he cared about was the truth for himself, the truth of Athens. And Ellacuria says that the university has that role to be like a gadfly. It's a big fly that stings so hard it can even make a horse get up and go. So we need that jolt to arouse people. Uh, the first thing to be known, he says, is the reality that must be cultivated in order to know how it must be cultivated. We got to know what's going on now to know what we should do. You can't just start with what we should do if you have no idea where you are now. because you would never be able to figure out how to get to where you think we should be. He writes, culture as critical and operational consciousness is what the university should be required to provide. Knowing how things are and knowing how they ought to be, knowing what is being done and what should be done in the unity of consciousness. And the Spanish word there is conciencia, uh, which means literally with knowledge, conscience. In English, we have two words, conscious, which means aware and awake, and conscience, which is that voice that tells you what you should and shouldn't be doing. Well, in Spanish, it's the same word. It just means your conscience means you know, you're aware of what you're doing and whether it's right or wrong. And he says, in a unity of consciousness, which is ultimately the operative and historical unity of a people seeking itself with help from all. The university should cultivate. So culture equals ethics equals knowing what you are in order to know how it's best for you to be. That's the field or sphere where the university works. Culture, Ellacuria says, is always culture of. You might remember that hyphenated phrase uh, back when we studied Zubiri's book, Man and God, when he talked about notes. A substantivity, a thing, is a unified system of notes. And he says notes are always notes of. They're not free floating. The notes are what they are as a function of respectivity or the openness of the real. Things are what they are with respect or as a function of everything else. He writes on page 185 of this essay, Ellacuria does, consciousness and culture are not absolute, detached, and on their own. They are always someone's consciousness and culture. And in each case, we should be very clear about who this someone is, right? We need to know whose culture we're working in, who's benefiting and who's not benefiting. Now, he points out a risk. He says the difficulty inherent in promoting a culture of the people without getting away through the use of the requisite theoretical tools from the very reality that one is seeking to cultivate and raise to awareness. And what's he talking about there? Well, university people are highly educated. You students are very educated compared to the general population. Faculty certainly are highly educated. We have our own terminology, we have our own language, we have our own methodology, we have our own logics, we have our own research methods and experimental methods and techniques. And the great masses of people, especially in El Salvador, in that situation for sure, did not have access to those things. They did not have those capacities, as Zubiri put them, didn't have those capacities. So the trick would be, well, how do you do something for the people that you want to help, the 99 percenters, the poor masses, the oppressed? How do you do something for them without uh, drifting away into some abstractions that you get in university life? The question I've posed this before: how does the university, or how do we, speak for the voiceless? If the great majority, the poor majority, are those without a voice, those without being, the me on, as they say in Greek, well, how do we speak for them? What kind of is, are we speaking for them, or are we doing ventriloquism? I don't know if ventriloquists are popular anymore, but you have a puppet and the ventriloquist makes it look like the puppet's talking, but it's really only the ventriloquist's ideas. The puppet's just the wooden dummy, doesn't have a voice. Well, what's going on? Is it possible for the university, for the educated, for the scholars, the researchers, to be the voice for the voiceless? Or are we putting our voice into the mouths of the voiceless, saying things not that they would say, but saying things that we think they should say or we want them to say? That's a risk. That's a problem. And we have to keep thinking about that as we go. The way or the method of the university, according to Ellacuria, is what he calls the efficacious or the effective word. And by word here, he means the communication, reception, and comprehension of culture as it is re-elaborated in the university. So the idea here is the university studies culture, studies what is, provides models of what might be, and then pushes that back out into the culture, publishes that, makes public that, disseminates that self-understanding to see if it's really a self-understanding. And he says this word, what we produce or what we publish, make public, must be powerful, which he means characterized by rationality and scientific validity. It can't come across as, let alone be, just some mere opinion of woolly-headed intellectuals somewhere. It has to be rooted in reason and scientific uh, 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 validity, and must be aiming at solutions that might actually work to problems that are real, not solutions to problems that no one has. The word must be made history, he says, that must take flesh in historic structures. Now he's speaking with a Christian metaphor in his mind. It's not enough just to know things. You got to make it effective in the world in historical concrete circumstances. New consciousness must be embodied in structures and in institutions. You got to turn those ideas and those visions into practices. The disposition of the university? What's the attitude? He says aggressive. It can neither be conforming nor conciliatory. Can't just go with the flow. He says reason is inherently aggressive when faced with positive irrationality, not the absence of reason, right? If reason faces irrationality, it just bristles. It just gets aggressive. It has to act, has to move. Injustice makes reason even more aggressive. Nothing gets the mind going like the recognition, the realizing the weight of reality, the recognition that there's injustice. That provides that ethical pinch, that shouldering of the weight of reality that gets reason to work so that it could take charge of the weight of reality. They can act aggressively to bring about justice. Now, having said that, he says uh, the disposition of aggressiveness does not imply irresponsibility. When you read Ellacuria, you get the idea that he's not about posturing, he's not about making like public gestures without any real substance behind them. And he says it's definitely not an invitation to use non-university means. He's very uh, um, adamant about this idea. Universities are about teaching, learning, researching, experimenting, and publication. That's what universities do. And he says we cannot give them up. We cannot become some other kind of a thing. We can't become a church. We can't become a political party. We can't become a paramilitary force. We have to do what universities do, and we have to do what university people do. So, in our aggressive efforts to promote justice, we can't lose ourselves in that battle. Objectivity, though, is not at odds with aggressive assertiveness. Again, like he says, objectively, the situation may demand strong measures. He writes, university protest does not require shouting or violent actions to make its protest, but it is quite the opposite of a passive and contemplative attitude. We just sit back and ponder things. It is active and nourishes hope. It wants to struggle for a better future, knowing beforehand that this future will not come as a gift. If a better future is possible, then somebody's got to stand up and go and take it. It's not just going to be dropped into your lap, he's saying. The objective of the university, what's the goal here? What's the university trying to bring about? He says the structural transformation of society. In his words, he thinks the university should help assist to build a new human being and a new earth. Now, he says the university is not primarily aimed at changing persons, but at changing structures. And that's another thing that we maybe need to think about. Uh, One of those philosophical chicken and egg questions. Which comes first? Transform persons results in transform society and transform structures, or transform the structures and it will transform persons. We know what Marx thinks. We know we have to change our concrete material practices if ideas are genuinely going to change. Um, but Ellacuria says, look, it's not one or the other. These are not mutually exclusive, and you can work on both of them. But as a university, the goal is to change societal structures, the bigger picture. It's about changing the national reality, he says. And again, he repeats this, which he said in an earlier lecture. It's not the main objective of the university to train professional people. It's not the main objective. It's an important objective, though. Right? Don't lose sight of that fact. It's important to do it, but if you make it the main objective, you are missing what ought to be the main objective, which is the structural transformation of society towards justice. Uh, so, uh, Structural transformation of society, the salvation of the personal cannot realistically ignore the structural. You can't be the best you can be if you have to live out your life under the yoke of unjust structures. It's not possible. Aristotle told us we're social political beings by nature. If social structures are unjust, we cannot flourish, we cannot thrive. In fact, and this is the hardest part for some people, the minority, to recognize, even if this social structure is benefiting us in a material way, Ellacuria still wants to argue that it's deforming us as human persons if we operate in an unjust situation. Now, again, I think you need to think that through what he's saying and determine whether you agree or whether you think he's missing something about that. But it's an old idea. Even if it looks like we're doing pretty well, we're the ones on top, we're the elite. That's pretty good. Wouldn't want to trade places with the 99 percenters. But the argument is we elite are still missing something. Now, is that right or not? The question is, quote, what way of structuring society permits the full and free development of the human person, and what kind of personal activity should those persons undertake who are involved in transforming structures? That's the question we all need to think about. All right, so to review, for Ellacuria, for the UCA, for his university, 10 years on after its founding, he said, our university is characterized in the following way. Our horizon is the poor majority. Our field or sphere of operation is culture. Our way is what he calls that efficacious word that comes through university means of teaching and learning and research and experimentation and publication. Our disposition ought to be in a horizon that is rife with injustice. It ought to be aggressive, and our objective is to build a new human being and a new earth. Now, he starts to reflect a little bit on the concrete situation. That's what a university should be about. And he says, well, there's no contradiction between the university and politics. They're not really separate from each other. He said it would be suicide to abandon the real possibilities of the university in order to change the country. That just goes back to what he says. As university people, we have to stick with university means. He thinks that's important to stop being a university, to remove the university as an institution, as a structure in a society would have devastating consequences, he believes. Even if we had all good intentions to say, oh, let's stop doing what universities do and just get into the fight, he thinks that would be a tragic mistake. He says it would be suicide not to use the real possibilities of the university in their full political potential. Why? Because the university lives in society, and if society is corrupt or unjust, it's going to have pernicious effects on the university. It's in the university's best interest to pay attention to the political, concrete, historical reality in which it finds itself. It's essential. It would be suicide not to do that, because then whatever you're teaching and learning about is just abstractions. It's a fantasy stuff. There have been, he says, obstacles to our attaining our hopes for this institution, the UCA. 10 years on, there have been social factors. There's dependence on economic factors. The university, needs funding. Economies distribute their wealth in a variety of ways, and his university, not unlike all our universities, is at the mercy of economic factors. We're not totally independent of what's going on in the economy. And it raises the question, is a university free if it is dependent on funding that can be halted at will? If the university is dependent on government funding that could be cut off like that, or the funding of private donors, which could be withdrawn like that, can a university really be free to operate? Social and political resistance of the ruling interests have been an obstacle to the UCA attaining its goals. He says this includes, and I'm quoting now, resistance from students who do not want to be disturbed with regard to their interests, whether present or future, and who prefer technical training that does not challenge them either on their present involvement in society or their future ethical incarnation into the country's structure and functioning. Now I'm going to throw that right back on you. You've taken this course most likely uh, because it was a requirement fulfilling one of the check boxes of your overall curriculum. I know for a fact very few of you are majors in philosophy or political science, but you have to take this course. And this course, I think you'll find these thinkers that we're encountering are asking challenging questions. And we have to ask ourselves whether we would be happier if we didn't hear these questions or didn't have to think about these questions. I don't want to be disturbed by this. Look, it's a tough world. I want to get my degree in business, and I want to go out and get in business and promote my brand and sell my product and come out on top. That's what I want to do. I don't have time to be worried about all this ethical and political stuff. Well, if the goal of the university is to produce, a new human being and a new society, then that's an obstacle if people don't want to do it. And he says, look, it's not just the students. Professors are the same way. He said, look, I've gone to school for a million years. I've been in school my whole life. Now I got a chance to teach and think about the subjects that interest me, and I want to work on them. And I'm not really interested in what's going on in society. I just want to read my literature or do my studies or experiment in the lab. I don't really care what's going on with society as long as it more or less leaves me alone and I can keep working. I don't need to focus on these big moral problems of injustice. He says faculty frequently don't understand or acknowledge their own political responsibility just by the very fact that they work in a university, as he understands it. He says it includes resistance from administrators. Why not? Well, they don't want to rock the boat with funders. If there's a bunch of courses that poke holes in the reigning ideology of, say, capitalism, then maybe capitalists don't want to fund those kinds of avenues of questioning. But I would make sense, right? I understand that. Uh, he says basically, like, look, we've set up this university with these intentions to fight injustice, to right the wrongs. And and a lot of the people here don't want to do it. The students because they're just trying to get a job after going to school, and the faculty because they just want to teach their thing and don't want to be bothered, and administrators because they don't want to lose funding. So here we are with a big goal, and everybody might sit around and say, you know what, it's a great goal, it's a fantastic goal. Let's get rid of injustice, but I don't want to do it. Somebody else do it. There's a if you have the text, there's a ironic footnote on page 192. He writes, Latin American universities generally enjoy legal autonomy. For example, the military or police cannot enter their precincts. Hence, even in military controlled countries like El Salvador, the universities have been sanctuaries for ideas that could not be expressed elsewhere. Clearly written, 14 years before he was assassinated for promoting the very ideas that we're talking about now. Um, yeah, that's a other kind of resistance, an external resistance from government and business and the military. There have been, he says, lack of proper resources. There's competition for good people. Business and industry pays a lot more. I did not always teach at the university. I had jobs in uh, nonprofit corporations, for-profit corporations, big old line industry, high tech. I've done a number of things, and speaking personally for myself, I got paid a lot more money to do those things. I did. So there's a lot of competition, a lot of pull for good people to say, wait a minute, I could just do better for myself and my family if I did other things. Teaching doesn't pay very much, is maybe not even all that much respected as it is in some other places. Why would I want to do that? Um, you know, corporate funding, on campus. What gets funded? What kind of programs, get funded? I mean, these are questions, and he raises again this question of just the very look and feel of the place, what we call the physical plant, the buildings, the structures, the gardens, the walkways, the fences, the walls. Uh, you know, maybe it keeps the university from interacting with just those people that he thinks the university ought to be working for, whether that was the intention or not. He says, especially in El Salvador's economy, man, it's a poor country, and we spend a lot of money on these buildings, and the way it looks, he says it sends a message to poor people. Look, this place isn't for you. This is for well-to-do people. Look how shiny and clean everything is compared to where you guys are. He says that's a problem. That's an obstacle for attaining that. Look, even here in the U.S., here, look, take our own campus. Just look around. The money spent on buildings uh, versus the money spent on faculty and teaching. You think you may be surprised. That's not just unique to this university. Where's the money go? What's it going into? He talks again about this bourgeois structure of society. He says that, as we heard earlier, it's oriented towards a capitalist system. To repeat on 193, he says, indeed, most of those involved in the university, whether students, including their family circle, or professors and administrators, do not feel that a profound structural change is urgently needed for the sake of their own interests. Indeed, such change would not bring them great material advantages. He's recognizing the reality that people realize that if I did something for the greater good, it may not be for my individual good. Now, you might be thinking in the moment of the moral philosophy of utilitarianism, of John Stuart Mill, among others. The idea that one ought to do the greatest good for the greatest number. That's the right thing to do. Whatever produces the net benefit for the greater net benefit, that's the choice. That's what you do. But that doesn't necessarily motivate people. The greater good, includes people who live on the other side of the world who I don't know and I never see and never will see. Will I act always in their interest over my own and those who are closest to me? Hard to say that I would. He says, look, even we here in El Salvador, where 99% of the people are poor and oppressed, we have little real contact with the oppressed majority. We speak highfalutin language. We talk about books we're reading, and they're not reading any books. In particular, we're cut off from them, and yet we're supposed to be working for them. He writes, quote, the knowledge mastered and transmitted does not originate in the needy real world of the bulk of the Salvadoran people, nor is it even neutral or antiseptic. It is generally the watered down knowledge cultivated by dominant countries so that they can remain dominant. Right? Even what we work on here it's not coming from an express need of the poor majority. It's coming from the traditions of education that came from Europe and North America. He said, look, like any new experiment, there was a trial and error process, simply a matter of trying to create a new model along with the conditions in which it could work. Conditions that did not exist is tough. How do you do that? I need certain conditions to hold in order for my experiment to work, but I need my experiment to work in order for the conditions to be put into place. It's a kind of a catch-22 there. I'm stuck. It's circular. I need the university to create those conditions, but I need those conditions to create the new university. Are there real possibilities for achieving a new kind of university? He says, well, it's necessary, so therefore it must be possible. I love the optimism of that. I need to do it, so it must be possible to do it. Not all philosophers agree with that. Certainly Nietzsche would not agree with it. Just because we need something doesn't mean that it's possible or that we can get it. He says, look, the university is a fact. It is a part of society. It's a part of tradition. It's been what's handed over. It's there. He says, society might not want a university that fosters critical consciousness or that pressures for change, but it will want trained professionals. It needs that. Business needs, educated workers, trained workers. So society will invest in the university. And he said, certainly in El Salvador, where there's only two now, I think there's more than two now, but more or less the same goes here. No one's going to totally quit the university. They're not going to quit it because, instead of having costly job training programs at the corporation, I'll just get people to pay for their own training at universities. Instead of having a minor league professional football team, of colleges. No one's going to quit colleges right now. So the goal then is to make the most out of these possibilities for the real needs of the national reality, he says. Uh, and we got to figure out how to live in the meantime here. We've come a distance. We got a ways to go. Society is not all it should be, so the university won't be able to be all it could be. So, what do we do now? He says, look, again, we are not a political um, party. He says we're not training people to take over power. It couldn't be done. It doesn't really make sense. That's not what we're doing. What we could do, he says, is, in his words, provide ideological cover for activists, showing the irrationality of the current practices and the rationality of transforming change. We give them ammunition for those who are doing something different, who are political activists, not us. That's the university. Our political role is to provide knowledge, to provide studies, to provide models, to provide ideas. The activists, arm them to be able to show that what's going on is irrational, and what we might do would be better. He says, between not fomenting the needed changes with all one's might and resisting those changes with all one's might, there's a wide range of possibilities. And the university, through its rational analyses, can do a great deal to make actual aggressive resistance less virulent. Again, he's a believer in rationality. He's a strong believer in rationality. And he thinks rationality is a tool to attain freedom, and he thinks it's a tool, I think, ultimately to attain a peace, because peace will come when we can do away with injustices. So he thinks that a lot of resistance, righteous resistance, I'm being hurt, I'm going to do what I can to make you stop doing that can be pretty virulent. He thinks university means uh, can help that resistance be itself more rational, more free, more peace loving, and ultimately more effective. Now, he lists a number of what he calls his current achievements or the university's current achievements and some anticipations. Creating a new awareness about what a new kind of university might be. Well, we're doing that. Proposing a new model for such an institution. Well, I'm working on that. Bringing to public a theoretical analysis of some basic issues in society. We're definitely doing that. We're commenting on serious events on technical and ethical grounds through our publications, putting this material out there for people's consideration. We're doing that. We're confronting developments with an independent voice, a university voice. That's a different kind of thing, which he keeps arguing. We're doing that. Providing society with trained professionals. That's what universities have to do too, who work for deep and rapid change. We're trying to work with the people who are here. And serving in a limited way, at least, as a voice for those who cannot make their voices heard. But as you heard, I think that's a complicated and challenging, provocative, controversial idea that we need to think about. And he says that we do provide immediate help to the neediest in any way that we possibly can. And we're trying to open a new horizon for the future that gives us a better view of what's really going on and what could be going on. So what do we do next moving forward? Well, students, he says, we can't just admit more poor students. It's misleading to think that a university is for the poor if you get a bunch of poor people coming in and you don't charge them any tuition. Because like I said earlier, the minute you cross the threshold of the university, you're already part of the elite or on your way to the elite, or certainly very tempted to take your place with the elite. So that in itself, just admitting poor people tuition free in itself is not going to solve the problem. He says the important point about the character of a student body is not where they come from, but where they're going. He wants to talk more about the future, where they're going, wherever they've come from. And he says we should try to only admit students committed to, quote, urgent and deep social change. Let me repeat that. We only want to admit students here who are committed to urgent and deep social change. I think you got an issue there too. First of all, how are you going to figure that out? You put that up there on your website. Here's who we're looking for to be students at the UCA, at that time one of two universities, a chance to get into the elite. Are you one of these people? Well, yes, I am. That's what you're going to put on. That's what you're going to put on your application for admission. Yes, I am. I very much I'm interested in urgent and deep social change because you're telling me if I'm not, you won't admit me. Uh, can we figure that out? How are we going to figure out which students are those? And how do you know that students when they come in, especially if they come in young, what's going to change their mind? What they're going to look at? Hard to say. And what about teachers? Well, same goes for them. He says, in a sound and well organized body, there is no room for alien and counterproductive elements. In other words, people who are working against this mission. This statement, he quickly says, does not in any way entail dogmatism nor any attack on freedom to teach, since commitment to structural change in the country does not predetermine what should be taught or how. The only thing ruled out are professors unwilling to commit themselves to the social function of the university in this country. Even if you like that idea, I still think there's an important challenge there when he says, look, you got to be committed to this, but that does not limit what you can research and teach. Again, I just have to ask, does it though? Is there some kind of a narrowing of a concept of academic freedom here? There might not be, but it's worth considering. I could see where there would be criticism of this idea. What to do next? Strive for financial autonomy. Well, that would be every university administrator's dream everywhere. He writes, what is needed is real autonomy, independent self sufficiency. Independent of what? The answer is easy. Independent of whatever pressure the dominant society uses in order to domesticate the university, to tame it, to get it to not ask the tough questions. The implication is that the university should depend as little as possible on financing under the control of people who want either to maintain the prevailing situation or to strengthen it with minimal improvements. Careful whose money you take, he wants to say. Uh, when we strive for financial autonomy, that's a great goal. How are you going to do that? Here's one of his ideas: charge the beneficiaries the full cost of what has been spent on them. Even though if you're at this particular university where we are right now, you're spending a lot of money on tuition. But the fact is, you don't cover all the costs of running this place. Even that, even you, even all the very large amounts of money that you're spending, you don't cover the full amount. And that certainly would be true in a poor situation of poverty like you'd find in El Salvador at that time and today. So his view is, okay, once you get through this system, though, you got to pay back. You're on the hook for everything it costs to get you where you were in the elite positions of society. You owe it to this university, is what he wants to say. Well, you could think about that. Strive for the greatest independence from all those who favor the present system because it favors them, for them themselves. You need to be independent of those few who are benefiting from the situation. He says the corollary of that is the greatest possible contact with poor oppressed majority, which he said we've not been good at that. We talk our own language. There's the intellectual barrier to join that conversation is pretty high. We got to make better strides to be with the poor we say we're working for. He talks about these threefold functions of the university, which he keeps saying that this is what it means to act as a university and not as something else. Research, which is directed towards the needs of the national reality. Teaching, he writes, if such major disciplines do not contribute towards understanding the national reality better and transforming it, they do not deserve to be in the university. For such a university would be an intolerable luxury in a poor country. Now, that is something that is a very interesting thought. So suppose you went to the UCA, could you major in, I don't know, Renaissance poetry, Italian Renaissance poetry? How would that contribute to the self-understanding of the unjust social situation, the horizon of El Salvador? It may be hard to make a case that it does. And he says, look, that kind of a thing would be a luxury in a country like that. Now, this is a very wealthy country. You and I are discussing these matters. Is there room even here for something we could afford, at least in principle, but we start to treat like a luxury itself, like Italian Renaissance poetry? The liberal arts are the the majors, the disciplines, the departments that are getting cut the quickest. Used to be that's what a university was. It was the liberal arts and the sciences. Now what is it? Business, business, technology. Those are the main majors, and funded by business and technology that operates on a certain economic model, not another. So it makes it seem even here in a rich country, if you take the point of view of the status quo, the situation in which we find ourselves in, some of those other things begin to look like luxuries. Not because it offends against the money being spent, but people think it's not worth anybody's time. The university is for job training. We got to aim, he says, to create a new human being, be better. And then the third aspect, function of the university is social outreach or social projection. We should try to shape the collective consciousness of our societies. He says the university should sow its seeds over the fields of the nation and not only in cloistered gardens. We shouldn't just be talking to each other as academics, as teachers and students. We need to be talking to society. He says, now, what about the Christian meaning of the university? Well, he's a Jesuit institution, at least in its heritage. How can Christianity energize our university endeavor without impairing it in any way? And we talked about this issue of what does he mean by Christianity? And this is what he writes in this essay. He writes, a university's Christianity cannot be measured in terms of doctrines defended, sacraments distributed, or piety practiced. Universities do not exist for such things, and to be involved in them is a waste of time for a university. The university has its own structure, and here and now it ought to have its own ends and its own very specific means. The important thing then is to show how its Christian inspiration can promote and energize those ends and means, even without imposing any religious obligation. Now, that may be put too strongly, right? That may be too strong. If it's not too strong, if what you mean by a Christian university would be a university that's all about theological doctrines and sacraments and piety and observations and liturgies and all that kind of stuff. If that's what you think the university is, then he says, well, no, that's what a church is. That's not what the university is. And I think that's what he means. It's a waste of time if that's your focus. I don't think in any way he's arguing that you ought not to have Christian piety on campuses or liturgies on campuses. I mean, they have. I've been to the campus of UCA. They have a chapel there. Of course they do. I don't think that's his point when he says it's a waste of time. It's a waste of time thinking that that's what it's all about. That's a mistake. The university is about research, teaching, and social projection. That's what it's about. So the Christian inspiration ought to organize our focus in doing those university things. That's what he means. And he says that the Christian university is not just for Christians, then. It's not just for practicing Christians, at least in his view. His own theological contribution, this idea of salvation as a liberation of history. He writes, the notion is not that salvation is limited to salvation within history, but certainly that its liberation is through salvation within history. This liberation is a process embracing the whole of the human being and the whole of history in pursuit of the freedom and fulfillment of all human beings. Salvation is not about the great by and by, not about the next life, but this life. A university like ours, precisely as a university, cannot forget the here and now situation in which it exists and from which it must separate itself in striving for change. We're in this world, but we're not of it, is a very biblical idea. And he's saying the same thing. The university is in this culture, but it's not of this culture. It's looking for what might be, not just what is. Liberation has to do with both structures and persons, both the requirements of nature and the options of history. The common starting point of the university and Christianity, he points out, is that both the university and Christianity are against dehumanization, against dehumanizing. Both are for building a new human being and a new earth. He writes, the University of Christian Inspiration is not a place of security, selfish interests, honor and profit, and worldly splendor, but a place of sacrifice, personal commitment, and renunciation. This is fundamental and does not need to be spelled out in confessional terms. You don't have to uh, get it written. This all written up by the Vatican. He would say it's fundamental to what a university is supposed to be about. He writes, quote, a university is a Christian university when its horizon is the people of the very poor who are demanding their liberation and struggling for it. Thus, it is a university whose fundamental commitment is to a change of both structures and persons, with a view towards a growing solidarity, a university which is willing to engage in dangerous struggle on behalf of justice, a university whose inspiration for making ethical judgments of situations and solutions and for the means to use in moving from such situations to solutions is the inspiration of the gospel. It is also, some of us believe, his writing, a different university the country needs. And my question to us is, after hearing all this, do we need in our situation, with our horizon, in our field, with our disposition, with our goals, our objectives, do we need a different kind of university? A little different, very different, radically different, no different? What kind of university do we need? What kind of philosophy do we need to fulfill what it means to be a university here and now, what it means to be a philosopher here and now, what it means to be a person here and now?